Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, where we go beyond the headlines to dissect the forces shaping global finance. And very much, certainly under Trump, it's going to be all about trade. I'm Michael Avery, and today we're going to try and lasso the economic whirlwind that is Trumponomics 2.0. Love him or loathe him, Donald Trump's return to the White House is already sending shockwaves through markets, and his economic playbook, featuring tax cuts, deregulation, and you guessed it, tariffs, is once again up for debate. The big question, is Trump about to double down on protectionism, and what does that actually mean for global trade, for emerging markets and South Africa's exporters? If history is any guide, we may be looking at a rerun of his first-term trade wars with even higher stakes. Well, you're tuned into the Monocle Banking Podcast, and this is what we're going to be tackling this week. Well, more than 90 years ago, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, surveyed the wreckage of the Great Depression, and he pointed to one of its causes. Sky-high tariffs had put America on the road to ruin by inviting retaliation and suffocating investment. It was a painful lesson, and it took decades of sustained global effort led by America to bring tariffs down around the world and let commerce flourish. Well, from our vantage here in 2025, the perils of protectionism should still be abundantly clear. Tragically, though, if Donald Trump gets his way, America seems to risk repeating the errors of the past. Well, to help us unpack this, I'm joined by two experts who know global trade better than the back of my hand. Donald MacKay, CEO of XA Global Trade Advisors, and his colleague, Anneke Jansen van Vuuren, Manager of Data Solutions at XA. Welcome to you both. Donald, maybe let's just start by setting the stage here. I'm pretty sure you've never been in such demand as a trade policy wonk and expert as you are. I mean, these are not things that usually grab headlines, but Trump's economic policies, particularly his tax cuts and deregulation, really have been hailed as growth-boosting measures. But the tariffs then come with inflationary risks and market volatility. So from your perspective, just to set the context, how does kind of Trumponomics 2.0 compare to his first term?
Well, I think the first term, he was still kicking the tires and trying to figure out how everything worked. This time round, he's entered. He seems to have a very clear set of ideas of what he wants to accomplish. And it's a bit of tariff blitzkrieg, I guess. Everything is happening super fast, making it very difficult for anyone on the other side of this to perhaps settle down and figure out what to do. My guess is the speed is part of it. So, yep, Trump is doing an awful lot, changing his mind an awful lot. Yeah, just very, very busy.
If we look at it, Trump's economic philosophy often appears to be at odds with conventional wisdom. His Treasury Secretary, Paul Besant, seems to be shifting the administration's focus from stock market performance, which, most market commentators, when I chatted to them, said, don't worry, Donald Trump won't do anything to mess with the stock market. But Besant now seems to be focusing more on the 10-year Treasury yields. What is the signal about Trump's economic priorities this time around?
He's made it very clear. He has said it's America first. How that translates appears to be putting duties on any country that runs a trade surplus with the US. He seems to have a view that if you're running a trade deficit, you're giving money away to someone else, which, to be clear, is not what happens, but that seems to be his thinking. He seems to want to bring back the jobs. Again, I'm not sure how that will work given the low unemployment rate in America and the reluctance of people to actually work in factories. But this seems to be the thinking. He's, in addition, has just started fiddling with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, saying that American companies are struggling to compete abroad because other people get to bribe officials and Americans are not. And we have to level the playing field by allowing all of them to commit their bribery as they wish abroad. So that seems to be the thinking. Of course, we have Doge and the idea that we have to cut lots of fat out of the state. I think there probably is quite a lot of fat there. I'm not sure the way the fat has been removed is necessarily the best way to do it. But that seems to be kind of, for now, how he is addressing the problem.
Anneke, just to bring you in here, and let's talk about what the data tells us around tariffs and trade, and tends to happen when you draw up the tariff drawbridge. And what kind of numbers have you crunched around what impacts these tariff policies might have on the US?
So at the moment, South Africa is exporting roughly 156 billion rands worth of goods to the US. Of that, 75 billion was, for instance, under AGOA, which is roughly 48%.
So how much of that would then be uneconomic, uncompetitive if AGOA were to be withdrawn?
So of that, roughly the duties that we're saving is 2.6 billion. So that's roughly 3% of the total of AGOA that will be paid on duties.
Now, if you look at that figure, Donald, it doesn't seem to be a figure that, should make our manufacturing base weak at the knees. Given how weak our manufacturing already is, I suppose every little decimal point does count. What do you see as, let's talk about the AGOA impact? If AGOA and our preferential access is withdrawn, and let's remember it's a creature of statute, so a law will have to be passed. What do you think the net economic impact will be for South African exporters?
I think AGOA focuses on completely the wrong thing. I mean, it wouldn't be good to lose AGOA, but it would hardly be catastrophic. Anneke's right. It's the value of duty saved under AGOA is 2-point-something billion. And that concentrates, by the way, into a very, very small number of companies. So we really are saying that there are a few businesses that would take quite a big hit, and for the rest, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. But there's a signal that comes with AGOA, and when you're kicked out of AGOA, that is not a good look. So other countries which are not going to dig into the detail, but might say, well, if you're not part of AGOA and the US has booted you out, that could indicate something. But AGOA is not a big deal in our lives, despite everything you read in the media. I think the far bigger risk is that Trump has completely ignored the US's WTO obligations. He referenced the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, as the greatest trade agreement ever negotiated. And as soon as he took office, he immediately threatened very large tariffs of 25% on Canada and Mexico in direct breach of that agreement. So, the bigger challenge is not that we lose AGOA, which, by the way, I see no way South Africa is still in AGOA by the end of this year. The much bigger problem is what other random stuff does he do? So we've seen, for example, him saying there will now be duties on all steel and aluminium products into the US. Well, that's quite a lot of money for us. So that would certainly hurt. That's about 19.5 billion rand a year that we export. So that'll take a hit. But if he were to do that, it's a decent chunk of our lives. It would make a difference. But really, in the greater scope of what the US itself imports in that space, just as an example, this is really not that big an amount of money. So the US imports about $114 billion worth of steel and aluminium. The question into the US is, if you tack a big duty onto that, what happens to the downstream consumers of steel as the price of that product rises?
The volumes that you mentioned are phenomenal for the US. The America imports 25% of the steel it consumes, 4/5 of which is currently free of tariffs under agreements with Canada, Brazil, Mexico, and the EU. Those are its biggest suppliers. And it imports 70% of its aluminium, they would say aluminum, some 60% of which comes tariff-free from Canada. So, these levies are going to target commodities that Uncle Sam mostly receives from friends rather than foes, like China and Russia. What possible sense could that make from a targeted tariff perspective if the big concern, as is stated in Republican circles, is this fear around an imperious China?
I have no idea what Trump is doing, to be very clear. So I don't know what he hopes to accomplish with this. We know the unions in the steel sector and the aluminium sector absolutely love this, but it will almost certainly cost more jobs in the US than it would create. The US has no capacity to bring all of that steel production back home. Its steel industry is not doing terribly well, even with the protections that Trump threw their way. when Nippon Steel attempted to buy, Michael, I forget the name of the US, I think it was called US Steel.
US Steel, yeah.
Yeah, when Nippon attempted to buy it, I don't know why President Biden blocked that deal, but US steel industry is in trouble because they're old technology, they are not state-of-the-art. When a company like Nippon comes along, it has the ability to rejuvenate that. I don't know why Japan is viewed as a foe in this particular situation when Japan is one of the US's closest allies. So it's utterly bewildering to me.
I mean, if you look at the measures that we introduced in the first term, let's say that's a guide as to what might happen next. He did it in 2018. He announced a tariff of, I think it was 25% on imported steel and 10% on aluminium. But within a couple of months, he had reached a deal. This time around, he seems to be playing hardball. But the fact is, in The Economist, they say capacity only rose by 6% since 2018. And it didn't lead to a big boost in production, which remains below levels prior to COVID. So, it certainly didn't work the first time round. I want to come back, though, to the logic behind what he's doing here, because there's a theory doing the rounds, and it ties together sort of Trump's economic agenda, interest rates, the deficit reduction, and ultimately tariffs, because I think we can all agree that the US economy is running an unsustainable deficit and, spending at 6-7% in boom times when your overall debt is $36 trillion is clearly not sustainable. But the argument is that his Treasury Secretary Bessent is trying to shift that economic scorecard, as I said, away from the stock market, lower the 10-year bond yields, and then that directly impacts borrowing costs for Americans. And the thinking is that the deficit reduction through the spending cuts and the supply side reforms and deregulation can help suppress inflation and keep those borrowing costs down. But here's the kicker. If Trump's tax cuts need to be deficit neutral to satisfy the fiscal hawks and discretionary spending cuts won't be enough to plug the gap, then tariffs may be the only viable solution to raise revenue and finance the tax plan. So the hypothesis would suggest that we should actually expect not just the art of the deal type tariff saber rattling, but these tariffs to, in fact, remain in place. What do you make of the logic? Does the math check out, or do you see potential flaws in this approach?
No, it's nonsense, completely. So tariffs are a terrible way to collect a tax, and I'll tell you why. So what a tariff does is it discourages trade. You raise the cost of moving things across a border. It is inflationary by its nature, whereas an income tax taxes successful economic activity only. You have a job or you make a profit. If you run at a loss, you don't have to pay the tax anyways, whereas with a tariff, you do. So broadly speaking, the United Nations takes the whole of our tariff book and it says, let's break it up into three broad categories. We've got intermediate products, so think of raw materials here. We've got gross fixed capital formation, machinery, that sort of thing. And then we've got consumer goods or finished product, if you like. Now, when you put the duty on the finished product, well, the impact is not that bad because the supply chain is really short. But as you move the tariff further upstream into intermediate products or even worse into capital goods like machinery, you start to make everything downstream from there less competitive. So when you put up the duties on steel, then everyone in the US who's making things out of steel, think cars, for example, become a little less competitive. And what then happens is the incentive shifts to import the car instead of the steel or whatever else it might be. So the problem you've got here is Trump is hitting the duties at the wrong side of the supply chain. If you are going to increase tariffs, you need to do it as close to the consumer as possible. He's doing it very far away, which means those downstream industries will find themselves in deep trouble. So when you do something like this, what will likely happen is people will either begin looking for alternatives. There will be some sectors that just close down because if you need your steel at a particular price and it's now a lot more expensive, you are not competitive. It'll destroy your exports. So every person who is setting up a factory in the US is, number one, going to find their raw material expensive, which means their exports are not going to be as competitive as they should be outside of the market. They would have a fear of retaliation. So if you've got a factory in the US, you would be worried that your big market in Mexico could suddenly disappear in the middle of a tariff war because Mexico decides they need to tariff your product. It may not even be steel, might be something else.
Mm.
And so what is going to happen is, my prediction is it will in fact raise the deficit, not lower it. And I'm watching very carefully the 10-year Treasury price. I think the stock market's a meaningless measure, but I think that long Treasury price, what is happening there is important. And my guess is this does not reduce the deficit.
Anneke, I want to build on that and just say what might happen in an environment where that capacity that would have been exported into the US now starts looking for a home elsewhere. Do you see a chance of further dumping in the South African market? Because it's one thing that our steel industry has had to deal with, and that is, dealing with very cheap Chinese imports, which have effectively brought the industry almost to its knees, combined with a lack of follow-through on spending on infrastructure.
No, definitely, because we were talking about it earlier. The same with our exports, for instance. If we can't export to the US, we need to find other markets. So if you're moving into a new market where you're not competitive, so the best thing is to lower your prices. So it will definitely go both ways, where we'll definitely see more dumping, I think.
Donald, what should we be doing? Right now we've got this massive review of duties across the steel industry, and you've been very skeptical about the timelines that have been put in place. We've got the lobbying by ArcelorMittal around its longs business. I know you've called for the scrapping on the ban on export scrap, and the fact that the mini mills are there, do they need support? That's questionable. How does all of this now impact our local industrial policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's horrible. I think in an environment like this, it's hard to plan. Steel is particularly problematic because government has massively overexposed themselves to the steel mini mills, so they can't kind of let it go. ArcelorMittal has not been a competitive manufacturer of steel for a very long time. And they're now up against the mini mills, which are currently putting long steel into the market cheaper than China can because of the subsidies. Politically, there seems to be a reluctance to let go of the support for the mini mills. And so my guess is government does what it always does, which is it will try to give money to ArcelorMittal to make the problem go away. And hope if you give them money, that would sort it out. But I think the underlying problems in the South African steel industry are serious. ArcelorMittal is struggling to get their iron ore from the Northern Cape to Newcastle because the railway lines are not functioning properly. So you can't run a steel business if you can't get iron ore into your plant on a pretty continuous basis. So, their productivity in their factory is lower than it should be. They were pushed into taking over the old Highveld business in Witbank. They didn't get all of it, so the mines didn't come along. So now you've got this kind of semi-processed product coming out of Newcastle, being driven from Newcastle to Witbank, or I forget what the replacement name for Witbank is. So you've got these huge inefficiencies in there, and you're running up against mini mills, which are getting around 8.5 billion rand a year in subsidies. So something has to give. My thought should be that government should have started scaling down the support for the mini mills, but that doesn't seem likely. So my guess is they will just start to give money to Mittal as well. This doesn't fix anything.
Yeah.
As Anneke said, we predict the dumping of steel and aluminium will go through the roof as the US market closes. So, how do we deal with all of that? It's certainly not the way we are doing it.
It would mean that we're going to probably see even more intense lobbying for us to increase our own tariffs, under the guise of supporting industries, and some of them are uncompetitive. And should we not just allow the market to do what it does? Why do we need to support these mini mills, for example, in the first place? Surely if they're competitive, they should be able to stand on their own 2 feet. And if we can get cheaper steel from elsewhere, isn't that going to bring down the overall cost of what was the figure, 900 billion that we want to spend on infrastructure, according to the president's sonar?
Yeah, so we're at an inflection point where politicians are going to have to do that thing they never want to do, which is take a hard decision here. I'd perhaps map this out as follows. The mini mills will require support for as long as we have mini mills. So they don't run on gas furnaces, they run on electric arc furnaces, which means as South Africa's energy costs rise, they will just have to keep lobbying for more and more support. So my thinking is the mini mills, if you want mini mills, you have to keep subsidizing them. If you want ArcelorMittal to compete with them, you need to keep subsidizing Mittal. I mean, I don't know if you saw, Michael, but in order for Mittal to keep their plant open for one more month, the IDC gave them a interest-free loan of 380 million. That's a huge amount of money to pay for kind of 1 month. On the other hand, right across the border from us in Zimbabwe, you've got the Dinson Iron and Steel Company, DISCO for short, which is a state-of-the-art Chinese steel mill. We may find ourselves centering our primary steel production on Zimbabwe, as an example, which now has this amazing plant. And I'm told by people who know these things that this is, producing really good quality product. So we may literally be seeing the end of South Africa's primary steel sector. And if Zim becomes the focal point, then so be it. It doesn't look like anyone else wants to set up a primary steel mill in South Africa.
I mean, that the IDC would be throwing such good money after bad certainly beggars belief. And I'm sure we need to be asking some very hard questions of the ministry or the DTIC and others who ultimately these state-owned entities, DFIs, report to at the end of the day. The upshot broadly of where South Africa finds itself, just as we're running out of time, Donald, and in the crosshairs of Trump, quite clearly, there are some very unhappy Republicans with the way South Africa's foreign policy has continued to poke the US in the eye over Israel and Palestine, over cozying up with Iran, war games with Russia and China. I know the Expropriation Act has been mentioned, but it seems far more likely to me that the US is trying to send signals about the bad actors in the world and who we're choosing to make friends with. What would you like to see from this administration to try and avoid the worst possible outcome, and that is being placed on the US's bad actor list?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the presidency might want to have a word with his spokesperson who seems to put out the most incendiary comments. So that's not helpful. I think at this point we must recognize that in this David and Goliath battle, Goliath wins every single time. So we shouldn't pretend to be what we are not. I'm not sure it makes sense to be quite as belligerent towards the US as we are. I don't think South Africa, in principle, should just change its mind and walk back everything. But I do think, I'm not sure what benefit we get out of cozying up to Iran, for example. I'm not sure it was a clever idea to have the leadership of Hamas hosted in South Africa, as if they're not really Palestine's, or Palestine doesn't, I guess, exist, but Gaza's sort of Einsatzgruppen. We're dealing with people that are very bad actors. I'm not for a moment suggesting that Israel are a bunch of angels, but it's not clear to me why we would consistently align ourselves with some of the worst actors in the world. That just sets up all kinds of problems. You will recall the moment when Omar al-Bashir was smuggled out of the country by the government. So it's not clear to me why we're deliberately aligning ourselves with really bad players. This is not making our situation easier, and it's not making it easier for us to have friends who are not American, Europe, etc., who I think can find common cause with us, but find our foreign policy to be quite odious. And it's not obvious to me what we're hoping to get out of that.
Especially when one looks at the numbers and the deficit in trade between ourselves and those countries versus, the extent to which we stand to lose in terms of our trade with the US. Another question, and maybe just lastly, I'm not sure if you know this, but in terms of the mini mills, do we know who operates the mini mills? What's their total capacity? And has anyone done any work on whether or not these mini mills have ties to politically exposed persons?
Michael, let me perhaps just, regarding politically exposed people, I'm not 100% sure. That's a good question. But what we do know is the IDC's exposure to the mini mills is 14 billion rand, debt and equity, which is an enormous amount of money. We know that 2/3 of the companies that the IDC has an investment in, which are currently in business rescue, are mini mills. So the IDC's exposure to these mills is enormous. Again, I'm not sure if there are politically exposed people there. The mini mills are an important part of the industry. Oren Kaplan, the chair of Cape Gate, said that they supply more than 50% of the long steel in South Africa comes out of the mini mills. I'm going to take that number as gospel for a minute. The problem is the mini mills produce a lot of steel, but in a very narrow range. So there are many applications where you can't use recycled steel. I talked to the guys in the automotive industry. They're saying you can't use recycled steel to build a suspension spring, for example.
Yeah.
It has to be made out of virgin material. So they produce a lot, but in a very narrow range, which means in that range, the prices have collapsed because the cheap finance and the direct subsidies means there's overinvestment in the sector. And that is why the IDC is faced with such big write-offs.
Yeah.
But I would be surprised if a couple of familiar surnames didn't pop up, Michael.
Well, it's certainly something that I think is worth digging around on, and that, that resultant overcapacity, as you say, is to the detriment of the rest of the steel industry, including AMSA. Donald, Anneke, thank you very much. It's been an eye-opening, if not frightening, discussion on the real impact of Trump's economic policies and certainly what they mean for us here in South Africa. We are going to be watching the next, 1,440 days unfold with trepidation. Next week on the Monocle Banking Podcast, we're going to be tucking into the budget as we await an edification from Enoch Godongwana. Until next time, you've been listening to the Monocle Banking Podcast.